This season is finally here, and the Winnipeg Jets have announced their roster. Who made the cut and who didn't? Find out in tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, it is obviously the start of the NHL season. I know technically it did start last week with the Global Series games. I just ignore them, to be honest. I mean, I know that they did happen, but let's be real, right? The actual full, true season feeling doesn't really kick in until this week. And Winnipeg has made their final cuts to the roster. There's been a lot of consternation online. I've been a part of it, not because I'm angry about anything, but I guess I'm just a little frustrated, maybe a little bit disappointed. I don't know. I was hoping for a couple of different things with this team, but it just feels like for now, the Jets are for the most part kind of running it back. But we'll chat about that and sort of the roster itself, where it's strong, where it's weak, and what I think the Jets still need to do in just a little bit. But before we go any further, just wanted to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, looking at this roster, per Mitchell Clinton, we have the first official 2024 Jets, 2024-2025 Jets lineup. And, I don't want to say that I'm underwhelmed, partly because this team isn't that different from last year. But look, I'm going to be honest, I am a little underwhelmed. All the stuff that, Arneal preached in the offseason and how the Jets really tried to sell this as a youth movement this summer just doesn't really seem to have actually made an impact on the actual team. So your opening night lines are probably going to look like this: Connor, Scheifele, Velarde, Perfetti, Nemesnikov, and Ehlers, Niederreiter, Lowry, and Appleton, Barron, Kupari, and Iafallo. Then on defense, you've got Morrissey and DeMello, Sandberg, Pionk, Fleury, and Miller. In net, it's going to be Hellebuck and then one of Kakinen or Comrie. Hellebuck was not practicing today because he had a family thing. So for a bit, the Jets were carrying three goalies on. But looking at this team, let's be real, right? This Jets roster, it's okay. The top six has talent to be really good, but it's not arranged in the right way. And I look at how Connor, Scheifele, and Velarde performed in the preseason, and I'm like, we've already seen what they did last year, and I don't think we're seeing much different to start this year. So the second line of Perfetti, Nemesnikov, and Ehlers is now going to have to bear that burden, which for me just doesn't really make sense. If you have Ehlers and you have a guy who could honestly help Scheifele and Velarde out significantly, and you have Connor and Perfetti who actually showed some really good signs of playing well together, I just don't understand why Winnipeg continues to jam a square peg in a round hole. And the reason that I say this in particular is because this team does not have the luxury of having mediocre lines. This team has to be basically decent top to bottom, because if they're not, they don't have the scoring punch and individual talent to make up for it. I don't like saying that, but it's true. This team just doesn't have the elite star power of some of those teams like Edmonton or Colorado in previous years, Vegas and other seasons. This Jets squad is good, and it's relatively deeper-ish in terms of a good balance of forwards up and down the lineup, but you've got way too much riding on a top six that honestly might be more like a top one, because the first line, I don't think you're really going to be able to trust all that much. They will score, zero question they will, and they'll be very good when they're in a power play formation. But when you're looking at even strength, which is what the game is predominantly played at, the top line's going to lose a lot of battles, and that means that the second line and probably the third line are going to have to carry the slack. And if they're not able to do that, I just don't think that this team has quite enough punch as is constructed to get through. So I don't really worry too much about the Jets making the playoffs, but I do think once they get in, it's going to be a very short trip again. This team is just not deep enough to go toe-to-toe with those elite competitors unless Hellebuck's form in the postseason just turns around completely and he steals a series. But asking him to do that's probably not something you want to bank on. So, if we're talking about the defense, I mean, it's okay. The forward group for me, like I mentioned, lacks elite star power and probably a fair bit of shooting talent. The D pairings outside of the first pairing and the third pairing, I think you're going to have some issues. Pionk in your top four is going to be a problem. I hate to say it, but he just isn't good enough to be on the second pairing. Fleury, I didn't really feel was going to be a particularly strong replacement for Heinola. As much as I appreciate Fleury coming in and filling in, he just hasn't looked like, a top-end NHLer yet. And in fact, I don't even know if he's looked like a third pairing guy so much as maybe a tweener. So it's tough, right? He's going to have some big responsibility, and it's going to put a lot of the onus on Miller to be really good. But thankfully, Miller is pretty darn good. So maybe he can kind of carry that pairing and things won't look so rough. But overall, this blue line's just not great. It's okay. Much like the forward group, it's okay. But there are a couple of really big question marks and or red flags, and those are going to be enough to make it a problem once the Jets make the postseason. And again, I really don't think I worry about the Jets making the playoffs. I know that there was some buzz online about, the Jets not really having a lot of support league-wide as a playoff contender, but I don't really worry. I mean, this team, with a very similar lineup last year, barring a couple of changes, made the playoffs. And they did so in pretty impressive fashion. So given what they lost, I don't know that it's enough to really knock them down like tremendously. But, I do sort of wonder about Arneal's impact at 5v5. What kind of game is he going to have the Jets playing? Thankfully, the power play at least looks like it's a lot stronger. The PK's, still kind of a work in progress, so jury's out on that. But at least the power play looks decent, which if the Jets are just kind of like a so-so team at 5v5, then your power play could be a huge difference maker. I don't think you want to rely on that because that's not really a sustainable way to win games. But in the meantime, during the regular season, when it's maybe less of a concern, you can kind of get away with it for at least a bit. But I think the overall look of this team is just a solid wild card to bottom of the top of the central sort of team, right? And when I say bottom of the top, I mean like fourth, maybe third if we're really fortunate. Maybe you might think, the Preds or one of these other teams isn't really going to have as strong a season, but I think Winnipeg is just a little mediocre. I think they'll still be close to 100 points this season, maybe a bit under, but I don't know. I'm having trouble imagining this team really exciting people, and I think there's a couple of big reasons for that I want to chat about and kind of talk through in just a little bit. But before we talk about maybe a lack of enthusiasm for the season, just wanted to shout out our friends and partners at Indeed. We're all driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you have ever heard of Indeed or you've heard me talk about it, you know that they're one of the premier job hunting services. But for those of you who are actually offering jobs and you're looking to hire, Indeed also offers a super fast, flexible, and powerful engine that allows you to schedule, screen, and message all in one platform so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers who use Indeed agree that Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites. And as somebody who has actually used Indeed myself when I was looking for work, I can personally attest to the fact that the service is super flexible, the resume builder is very detailed, and it actually offered me positions and showed me stuff that was relevant to not only my work experience, my salary requirements, but also just my general domain of expertise. And so for somebody who's offering a job, I have to imagine that it's a great platform. And again, it's super easy, very convenient. There's over 3.5 million businesses worldwide that are already using Indeed, so I highly recommend that you join them as well. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're chatting about perhaps some disappointment, maybe some lack of enthusiasm, and some general frustration from the Winnipeg Jets fan base regarding this year's roster and some of the stuff that I think was promised and what Winnipeg has kind of delivered. So let's get this out of the way, right? None of the kids made the team. Salamanson got demoted today. Lambert and Chibrikov were already sent down. And so this team is basically the same, more or less, barring a few departures, as it was last season. And for a team that told us in the offseason this was going to be a year where the kids had a chance to really earn their keep for this team, I'm looking at this roster and I'm just not really seeing it. Now, there's a bit of a counter to this, right? So Rutger and McCrory made the Pens, but the Pens probably have a worse-ish overall roster. The top-end talent that they have is better, but when it comes to some of the depth and stuff, they're definitely lacking some punch. And so I think McCrory, being a more physically mature player and somebody who's probably a little further along in his development track, he's gotten his skating stride up to average. He did well in preseason. He got himself a roster spot and didn't actually get sent down, although I kind of wonder if that sticks. He was in a pretty good position to make the team. I look at Lambert, Chibrikov, and Salamanson, and I think that they faced a bit of a more uphill battle. The Jets don't exactly have crazy world beaters, but you look up and down this team, and for the most part, all of them perform at an adequate or well above adequate level. You look at Connor, Scheifele, and Velarde. Individually, those guys are never getting benched or anything, so you don't think about that too much. Perfetti, Nemesnikov, and Ehlers, those guys have all earned their keep at the NHL level. And so you start getting into the weeds with the bottom six, and you've got Niederreiter, Lowry, and Appleton, who, for better or for worse, were Winnipeg's big shutdown line, but that does mean that they did get used maybe more than they should have at times, because when you look at the goal scoring and support that they offered, yes, they definitely won the differential battle, but you kind of think about how much they actually scored as a unit, and it was definitely not as good as you'd hope for a team that was, or for a line that was controlling play as much as this trio was. The fourth line, who really cares? But, Baron Kupari and Iafallo are kind of interchangeable to me. Same with Gustafsson kind of flipping in and out. So, if you're looking for improvements, Lambert and Chibrikov probably could have improved the bottom six. And I see a lot of people are saying, well, you don't want Lambert out of the top six. I actually kind of disagree with that a little bit. I think Lambert wasn't really ready for the top six, but I would have liked to have seen him given maybe, you could do a way to have sheltered third line minutes for him, especially if you stop thinking about things in very purely top six, bottom six sorts of ways. But the Jets haven't really done that in a while. They did it several years ago when they had the roster depth of the 17-18 team, but they haven't been as flexible with their matchups and stuff recently. And so, the only guy that I thought had a strong enough camp right out of the bat to earn, a 10-game stint would have been Chibrikov. And he was probably not getting in over Iafallo or Appleton because this team loves their vets. And I think that's where, the vibes right now, especially if you're going by social media and some of the postings out there, people are kind of pissed. They're just frustrated. And I think, in previous years, I would have been mad. And when I was maybe a little younger and more, spunky, I guess I would yell about the Jets not really relying on the youth. Part of me is just not surprised. And I think that's why my personal feeling has been a little more muted. I want to be more upset about it, but I just can't bring myself to be arsed, to be honest. Look, I don't want to say that I'm apathetic, but I'm just so used to it and conditioned to it that it doesn't really register. This team has a habit of not really giving kids a big chance at a roster spot. And I think it's also fair to say that, to some degree, the kids, some of them didn't quite do enough to really wow anyone to, blow the doors off and get a spot. But at some point, you have to get them into the NHL to start getting reps and start seeing if they're capable of keeping up and if they can adapt quickly to the NHL. They might not do it out of camp straight, but they might do it over time. And that's where I kind of feel like this season, I think the Jets have a different objective than what I think they really should be going for. And to me, it just seems like the fan base is just kind of like, here we go again. We're running it back, and we're not really thrilled with that. The positive is that injuries will happen, and so you'll see the kids at some point. And I don't mean the injuries are a positive. I just mean you will see the youth play at some point. So that's good. Injuries, not so great. And, it probably will lead to a decline in quality of the team. But I just sort of wonder why the Jets are so hell-bent on keeping this team as it is when it wasn't really that good last year in the playoffs. You saw how much they had a strong regular season only to get humiliated once they made the postseason. And for me, I'm just like, if you saw that you got dunked on in the playoffs and you're only going to have a couple of home games if you use this roster again in the postseason, what are you realistically trying to do? Are you just happy to be in the playoffs? Because that shouldn't be your aspiration or your goal. And so either the Jets are going to do nothing and keep this roster as it is and hope that Hellebuyck just kind of does Hellebuyck, or they maybe have some kind of a trade or a move in mind, or they're expecting the kids to do really well with their demotion so that they can call them up maybe 30, 40 games in and really test them with this team. But I got to say, I think the overall vibe is disappointment, dissatisfaction. People just aren't that thrilled with this team. And it's hard to say that I blame them. You look at any one post about this roster and sort of who's made the team and whatnot, and you get 20, 30 comments or sometimes even less because people at this point may just not even care. They're tired of the team. I think you're seeing a lot of dissatisfaction, though, whether people are not engaging or they're irritated or they're just not really feeling anything. This team, I don't know, it's not really inspiring and engendering a lot of enthusiasm. I'd love to be excited about the season. I think I was a lot more hyped earlier before we started seeing Arneal's actual moves. And I say this because I look at the top line as really a symptom of the bigger problem here, and it's that the Jets are not making the changes internally to make this team better. If you didn't have the kids, but you still reorganized the lines so that you actually have a functional first line, I think I wouldn't be as frustrated. But this team is doing the same dumb stuff that it did in previous years, and we know that it doesn't work. So why go back to the same well? Unless there's suddenly a massive change and this team proves me wrong in a way that they've not really done before, I just don't think that the evidence supports this team being all that great once the playoffs roll around. There'll be a strong regular season team, they'll make the playoffs, and then they'll be out within a couple of games. And it's just, how many years do you want to keep doing that? I don't know. The trade deadline's probably not going to solve this team's biggest questions. And so you just really have to hope that at some point this year, the kids get a call up and absolutely light the lamp at a level you've never seen, because this team, as it is right now, looks like a first round exit if they make the playoffs. And that's not a guarantee. I'm not worried about them making the playoffs, but I wouldn't be shocked if they somehow slipped. All it takes is one bad injury to a top player or to Hellebuyck, and you are beyond screwed. There is no hope for the season after that. So I'm not trying to be like a doomer, but I just think it's frustrating to kind of go through these cycles with this team that, I don't want to say that they lack ambition, because I don't think that's really true, but I think Winnipeg is complacent in some ways to be a middle of the pack to upper part of the, lower end of the top of the league. And they're a perennial playoff appearer, but they're not really a true contender. And it's a shame, because I really feel like this team has the potential to be exciting, has the potential to be really fun, has some great underrated talent that if you organized it the right way could actually make this team better than it looks on paper. And I just don't understand why the team continues to kneecap itself at every corner. If you're going to forcibly find ways to make this offense and really the defense less potent, then why bother? I mean, what's the point of having these seasons? I don't know. I'm kind of venting a little bit, but it's just every year we do the same thing. And I said this in previous seasons. Sometimes it worked out better. Bonus got the team into some really good straights, and I think that there's a lot that he did that was right. But then you saw his tactical limitations when it came to his usage of guys like Perfetti, some of his stubbornness around the top six, all that fun stuff, and it ultimately cost them a playoff appearance, it cost them a deep playoff run because they got bounced very quickly, and the Jets' slowness became very apparent against a team that just skated circles around them. So for me, I don't know. I know that the Jets had an offseason that's generally been well regarded, but let's be honest, right? Winnipeg was probably saved from itself more often than not. So um, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to discredit the Jets here, but like the Jets were trying to sign Adam Henrique, Sean Monahan, probably even had some sort of cursory discussion with Tyler Toffoli. And any of those contracts probably would not have helped the team tremendously. I would have been okay with Henrique, but Monahan, Toffoli, any of those guys, no. So all that to say, I do wonder what the ticket sales and attendance looks like in a couple of weeks, because I can tell you the enthusiasm online is not that it's not that high. And if social media has any sort of window into the fan frustration that we're likely to see this year, I wouldn't be shocked if season ticket holders and general attendance are just down. So a lot to really digest, but I guess the biggest question is, all right, you're going in with a veteran-heavy lineup. When are we going to see the kids? I want to chat about that and maybe give some thoughts on the most likely scenarios in just a little bit. But before we go any further, did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. If you have followed the first 5 weeks of NFL action, you know that it's been wow. Some of the craziest games and strangest storylines we've seen to start a year in the NFL in some time. Look, I'm not the world's biggest football fan, but I'm a pretty loyal Ravens fan. I've sat through some great games, some heartbreakers, and some just big stinky poos that the Ravens have put out. But let me tell you, Ravens Bengals, if you missed that, my word, was that one of those Hall of Fame moment kind of games. And we've had quite a few of those. You've got Jaden Daniels down with the Commanders doing things that I don't think Washington sports teams ever expected. You've got the Vikings defense locking out opponents routinely. It's a crazy time. And maybe you're watching these games and you're suddenly getting a little bit of a hunch about an outcome, a player, something. Well, with FanDuel, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And when you place your first $5 bet, you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Again, that is with your first $5 bet. Make the most of your hunch and go to FanDuel.com right now. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just wrapping up with some final thoughts on, I guess, when we're going to see the youth movement with the Jets. It's clearly not to start the season, but inevitably there are injuries. Inevitably, guys get called up, and this is where I think Winnipeg, to some degree, is probably banking on the kids maybe doing better in a couple of weeks. I will admit that, most of our prospects probably didn't smoke, the competition in training camp and preseason. I think Lambert showed well against players of his level. Against NHLers, I think the physicality and stuff was kind of noticeable. I've seen people talk about his defensive game being a problem, and I don't know if they were watching the same player, because, defensively, he was fine. It's more like the physical stuff and the grinding in the corners where he did have some vulnerabilities. But even then, I think he still made some smart reads. He forced some turnovers. His back checking was pretty nice. So defensively, I didn't really worry about that so much. I think he had a lot of the right approach, but he just didn't control the pace of the game at the level that I think the Jets were hoping for. And that's maybe the big criticism you could have of him, maybe of Salamanson. Chibrikov, I think, was probably the guy who looked the most pro-ready, and I think he'll probably be one of the first call-ups, because I wouldn't be shocked if Ehlers gets injured. He gets hurt a lot. I hate to say it, but he does get injured a lot. And, Chibrikov could immediately slide into your middle six and provide some decent scoring punch, along with some good forechecking and energy. And he just seems to be a versatile little attacker who has all sorts of skill and enough, I guess, energy to compensate maybe for some of his defensive lapses. He'll have some risky passes, and you've seen that, but I think the overall net with him is going to be positive. All that said, other than injuries, I think Lambert's going to have to dominate the AHL. I think Chibrikov's going to have to be among the top leaders in scoring, and Salamonsson's probably not getting a look this year. I think Salamonson was good in camp, but I doubt the Jets really want him to play on his offhand. With Lambert, there's kind of an interesting question of whether the Jets also call him up as a winger instead, where they don't maybe have to have him dominate as much. But I feel like if you start taking him away from center and you don't really think about him as a player down the middle, you kind of take away some of what makes him special and why he's one of our most coveted prospects. He's going to be great as a winger. I don't really doubt that, but I think the Jets kind of drafted him with the intention of being your second line. And maybe one day, if everything pans out absolutely perfectly, your first line center. I think that was the expectation. And so if he goes out as a wing, I don't really feel like that's going to be the most productive use of his time. I don't think it's going to go badly, and I think he'll acclimate well enough, but I don't really understand where the Jets are going with all of this. And so, here we are again with a draft and develop plan that's yielded some early interesting fruit, but perhaps not enough to actually harvest right now. And maybe that's where the Jets are kind of at, is they don't think it's time. But I'll say this. The AHL is not really that great of a developmental league. It's talked about in that way because that's just where everyone who's not in the NHL but is still a high-end pro player that's too good for the ECHL goes. But for the Jets, it's not really that great of a dev league. The timing and space are different. The physicality can be at times a little overly exaggerated. The guys are going for big hits. You have more goons down there. And so I don't really think it's going to change things tremendously for Lambert, other than maybe he adds a few pounds. Maybe he gets a little bit stronger. Maybe it sparks him to be a little angrier in his play to try and earn a call-up. But I just don't know how much is going to drastically change over the next few weeks or months that's going to get him a call-up. He'd probably have to torch the AHL at a level that we haven't seen him do ever for a main non-injury call-up, unless they're going to use him as a wing and they make that change early. But all that to say, I think injury is probably the biggest chance that we see our youth, and I don't know that makes me really happy. I feel like at least one of our kids in Chibrikov deserved a look at the NHL level. And I think you have guys that could have been moved in the offseason to not only create roster spots, but also free up cap space. Cap space is really valuable when you start wanting to make deals and maybe go for some big trade deadline acquisitions. It's not something that the Jets are terribly worried about right now, but it could be an issue down the road. So I just don't know. I mean, I feel like I was excited about this season coming into the summer, and, everything since then following the, so-called analytics summit has kind of just put me in a bit of I wouldn't say bad mood, but I'm just kind of feeling unenthusiastic. I was excited. I was happier earlier. I just feel a little more muted now, and I'm hoping that the Jets prove me wrong, that they have this big kick butt season that just makes me look very silly, and that all of my worries are for naught. But I got to be honest, more often than not, when it comes to this stuff, there's evidence of why this stuff is a concern. I've been right about this kind of stuff before. There's been some scenarios where I've definitely been wrong, but I don't think that this is going to be one of them. So let's just hope that the Jets silence us and really, prove the critics wrong, because otherwise we're in for a good but eventually underwhelming season, as we've been through the last several years. But let me know how you're feeling about all of this. Are you excited for the season? Are you looking forward to the year? Are you maybe rethinking your season tickets if you had them before? All that fun stuff. Let me know in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets on Twitter. But for tonight's episode, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with a preview of Winnipeg's season opener. But for tonight's show, that is all the time that we have. Thanks for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.